Yes, fine. Okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Some announcement.
Yes, okay.
I had 3 minutes. Okay. 3 minutes. Sure. So we begin. Hello and good morning to all of you. Friends, welcome to the second day of the 10-day Gyan course on Eurasian geopolitics and the new game in Central Asia. Your interest in the course has been very encouraging, and yesterday's inaugural session and the lecture that followed after that has set the tone for the entire course. Today's lecture is on a very interesting topic, that is Eurasian strategic landscape, leading actors, the new great game beyond China, Russia, and India. So the duration of this lecture would be for an hour. Then there's going to be a tea break for about 10 minutes. Maximum it's going to extend till 15 minutes. So kindly have your tea and then reassemble. And then there is going to be a tutorial on the Eurasianness of Russia, China, and India. It's going to be a very interactive session. So I expect all of you to participate in it in a very proactive manner. And friends, kindly switch off your phones. And yes, thank you for your kind attention. Over to you, Professor Shawai.
Thank you very much, Professor Upadhyay, and all students present today and colleagues. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to meet you again for a session today for which I will have a clock to work with. And I will begin with reminding ourselves of a few things that I should not have possibly said clearly enough yesterday. The whole philosophy and epistemology behind my course is to come up with a definition or an answer to the question, is the new Central Asia at large a region? Very simple question. The answer to which is contained in the definition of a region, which is my suggestion at the end of an ongoing article, which I quoted yesterday from memory and which I will use again and again, and which will be sent to students at some point by the organizers. So we are looking at Central Asia, two words which echo some, in your minds I'm sure, a definition, which is to me the narrow definition of 5 countries. And I look at it as a region not only in the making, but at large, associating a number of neighbors, which are called peripheries in geopolitical terms, and come up with the answer to the question, is it a region? What is a region? How is a region part of the world's new mapping out of power relations? So this is my first point for this morning as a reminder. My second point for the introduction or the preface to today's session is to make it clear that I'm, so to speak, juggling with 2 dimensions all the time. The one I call the broader dimension, which is the new Asia in the making, the new Central Asia in the making, which includes a number of historical, political, sociological, or even cultural aspects. And the broad definition is not institutional, or is not strictly diplomatic or strictly legally defined. And the narrow conception, the narrow perspective, which as a shortcut I call the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or the Shanghai Cooperation, which the second narrow definition includes a number of institutional aspects, even quoting from the charter of the SCO and so on. So we are in between those two dimensions all the time, which means that this is not specific enough for those of you who like legal approaches to international phenomena, and which is perhaps too specific for those of you who prefer the large approach. So I should make these two things very clear before I begin, and briefly remind ourselves of what I tried to do yesterday, which is to approach the new Central Asia as a process, not as a given, not as a product, not as a result, but as a process in its own right, reorganizing the post-Cold War Asia, and a process set within the world dynamic called sometimes, with a very imperfect term, globalization. I mentioned that we should be mixing historical perspectives, the time perspective, a number of legacies that come from the past, which are definitely relevant, including very qualitative ones, but understand what I mean by the acceleration of scale, by which I mean acceleration in time of certain steps taken by the countries mentioned, but acceleration in space in the sense that space is being shrunk, space is being dynamized, space is no longer blocked by the two Cold War blocks, or space is no longer blocked even by borders. Borders have changed their nature. They have gone from lines of absolute sovereign separation to lines of crossing and lines of free movement, to quote a vocabulary coming from Europe. So are we still in the post-Cold War, or are we in something quite new? This is also a question, and the answer to that question is that we are into something new. To think in terms of post-Cold War is already outdated. To you students, it is something that comes from before your birth, so you don't even know what the Cold War was. I remember. But we are beyond the analysis that should mobilize Cold War concepts and certainly call them post-Cold War concepts. We're something new, the nature of which we are beginning to understand, but the nature of which is actually also new. So how can history be new? I said yesterday, how can the historical legacies and roots that come from the past be relevant and at the same time be outdated and replaced by contemporary questionings? Having said that, I mentioned a number of dates by which I tried to suggest that we should keep in mind the relevant dates that have made up the history of the past 30 or 40 years, or going back even further in time, and understand those dates are also flexible in their meaning. I mentioned the double meaning of 1991, and I mentioned the huge relevance of 1998 for this region, and on occasions I will also suggest that 2005 is a very crucial moment, not just because it is when countries become observers of the Shanghai Organization, 2004 for Mongolia, 2005 for India, Pakistan and Iran, but because there are a number of assertions deriving from the Astana summit of the SCO in 2005, which clearly indicate the direction in which the power setting of the new Asia is going. So this is what I tried to do yesterday in the introduction and chapter 1, which was cut short due to my poor management of time. So today's session on the Eurasian strategic landscape, leading actors, the new great game beyond China, Russia and India, is a bit of a strange title that seems to be suggesting that the key actors are other countries besides China, Russia and India. So I need to justify this and cover the lecture, which will contain 4 paragraphs. Yesterday I also used the concept of mistake. What is a mistake? What is a historical mistake? And I stick to my suggestion, it's only a suggestion, that we can use as a guiding lead the idea that the new Asia is characterized by the capacity to avoid mistakes which could have been made, which were not made. And that's a key, imperfect perhaps, but it is a useful key, I think much more useful than to think, as I said, in sort of post-Cold War terms and post-something terms. And I define the mistake as a decision made by actors with insufficient reflection or insufficient leeway. And so the word actors is in today's lecture's title, and indeed actors should be defined as decision makers when we say actors, we are leading to decision makers, obviously states and governments and sovereign political teams, but also other actors which are sometimes referred to as private actors, the business sectors in particular, which are relevant, if not as determinant as the public actors, of course. So actors make decisions. This is how they are defined. And indeed, actors of the new Asia are numerous, and they contain some actors, such as China, Russia, and India, which are sometimes referred to as the greater actors, or the heavyweights, or the determining participants. But other countries, notably the other SCO members and the observers, and I choose to begin with them today with the idea that if we don't begin with the other actors, we might forget them or neglect them or make another mistake, which is to consider them as one homogeneous block. And one of my paragraphs consists of trying to suggest that they are very different in their characteristics, foreign policy options, and attitudes on the world stage since the last 30 years. So when I say beyond China and Russia and India, I do not mean to downgrade those two countries, but to pick them up as key actors later in the course. This is what I mean by beyond. And so again in this session today, I will mobilize views or approaches which are the broad perspectives, mentioning in paragraph 1 the concept of disappearance, mentioning in paragraph 2 the concept of reinvention, mentioning in paragraph 3 the concept of independent course of action for those countries, and in paragraph 4, and I think this will open discussion for after the tea break, what the great game can be defined as, or what the great game is. Just a small anecdote which I think is relevant here. When I produced the collective book on the Shanghai Cooperation Organization about 10 years ago, one chapter was written by a colleague from China, and he kept referring in this chapter to, at the time it was before India was a member, he kept referring to the SCO dynamic as China, Russia, and the other lesser actors, or the other lesser states. And when I pointed out to him that when he meant the other lesser states, L-E-S-S-E-R, he meant countries such as Kazakhstan and others which were not negligible, or which were not just followers, but part of a process, at least formally as full participants. And I realized that to some extent my remark was not understood. That the view that the SCO dynamic of the post-Cold War Asia was basically Sino-Russian, and today the view of some that New Asia is Sino-Russian or Russo-Indian is relevant, but it is at least, as we say in French, on paper, I mean formally speaking, a process involving equal actors in the process. So let me begin with the idea that the first duty, so to speak, of those actors, whichever they are, is to answer the question of paragraph 1, what to do with, I'm looking for my other notes, where are they? Here. What to do what to do after decades of disappearance. I refer to this question, what to do often, as I did yesterday, because it is a question that is historically marked, asked in the early 20th century of the Russian rupture, but it is a grand question. What to do after independence? What to do after a revolution? What to do after a major upheaval of the systemic characteristics of a nation? The same question was asked of France, what to do after 1789, what to do with the Republic, how to invent the Republic over the monarchy and so on and so forth. And each of us comes from a country where such grand questions were asked of the nation, notably for India in 1947, and so on. So what to do after decades of disappearance, and I need to dwell now on the concept of disappearance. By disappearance, I do not mean that countries disappear physically, but that they disappear in geopolitical relevance due to dynamics of colonialism, dynamics of imperialism, and so on, for which we can take a few examples. Imperfect examples, as all examples are. Korea would be my first example. The dates of the disappearance of which are not fully agreed upon. Is it 1905 until 1945, or is it 1910? And I catch authors often saying that the disappearance begins in 1910, which is not factually true, because 1905 is the Taft-Katsuha Agreement and the appropriation of the peninsula by Japan. Whatever is the actual date, the disappearance lasts for 40 years, until 1945. One could argue that the ensuing years are also years of troubled re-existence, 45, 48, 48, 50, 50, 50, 53. You know all these days by heart. My point is that as a consequence of this disappearance, Korea was never part of its own fate, including the division and the separation, which lasts until today. Korea was divided in a similar manner to Germany, but the difference is that Germany was an actor of the Second World War, and Korea was not, because precisely when the war was decided, when the Japanese expansion took place, Korea no longer existed. So how could it be part of the process when it did not exist? Second example is the 14 Soviet republics that were unified and which disappeared under the Soviet construction, some of them in the 1920s, some of them in the 1930s, some of them in the 1940s. And the longest disappearance for some of them is 67 years. So they disappeared as sovereign actors. The extent to which is that they were not a party to their own division, the invention of internal Soviet borders, which were considered then as administrative borders, and which became, of course, international borders in 1991. So again, absent from the moment when key decisions were taken, and having to embark with the consequences of the decisions after independence was reached. My third example is your own situation, where India, in that sense, disappeared for the better part of 200 years, and then reappeared in 1947 as part of a process to which you were party, but not perhaps fully in command of, which is the partition of the country. And interestingly enough, I have another colleague from China, not the same one, who works on the unification of nations, and her examples are usually Germany and Korea, of course, and Vietnam, to which she's adding, to some extent, Yemen and India. And I said, why India? She said, because we must analyze India in the sense of the possible reunification, which is historically true and which is conceptually interesting, because it is not often suggested as such. My fourth example is Mongolia, which disappeared differently from the others until 1991. Mongolia almost disappeared in 1911 and was then supported by the then pre-revolutionary Russia. It almost disappeared again in 1937 and was supported and rescued from that fate from by then Soviet Union. And Mongolia re-emerged in 1991. And interestingly enough, Mongolia then seemed to be learning the lessons from history by devising a key concept of its foreign policy, of her foreign policy, which is the third neighbor concept, which ensures to some extent that Mongolia has an answer to the situation of cartographic squeezing between two countries, a totally landlocked country, and an independent post-Cold War, post-re-sovereignization after 1991. We'll come back to Mongolia at some other point. Now, China, last example, might be considered also as having disappeared, but differently from the others. Between 1911 and from the point of view of China, of course, 1848 until the early 20th century is one form of disappearance. 1911, 1949 is the not disappearance, but the upheaval of the Civil War. And as I said yesterday, 66 to 76, the isolation of the Cultural Revolution meant that China, on the diplomatic scene, disappeared in the technical sense of closing down embassies, foreign embassies in China, and closing down Chinese embassies abroad. So disappearance is a very touchy concept, and I hope I haven't said anything wrongly received by you. But disappearance does not mean non-existence. It's quite a different concept. Disappearance in my vocabulary means to be absent from decisions for reasons to do with the disappearance of sovereignty. Disappearance means an entering by force a subdued existence, which is a negative dynamic. The positive aspect of it is that disappearance is a moment when the preparation for reaffirmation takes place. And disappearance often is the dynamic through which cultural resistance is organized, linguistic resistance in many situations, cultural or religious maintenance in other situations. And for Central Asia, it is well known that under the suppression of religion in the Marxist ideology, the nation kept underground at home behind closed curtains, the practice of a number of ceremonies for birth, marriage, and burials, and the language, and the religion. And this ensured that after 1991, the re-emergence, the reappearance, the re-practice, so to speak, of those cultural aspects was very quick. Now, to finish on paragraph 1, almost on time, I wish to suggest that what disappeared or what reappeared in Central Asia, which makes it very complex, is borders. Borders were artificially invented as Soviet borders. They disappeared technically overnight, but the next day they reappeared as international borders. And this created a number of situations where local divisions took place. The Fergana Valley is, of course, well known, but many other examples are examples of people suddenly finding themselves across the border as divided families, divided villages, sometimes divided houses or farming lands, and so on. And there is an interesting series of books to be read on this issue of Central Asian borders, inventions, reinventions, and so on, by a colleague who is in Geneva at the present time. She's of Uzbek origin, Svetlana Gorshenina. I can write the name on the board at some point. And she has written a number of very thick books, on the invention of borders of Central Asia, Svetlana Gorshenina, suggesting that borders at the same time never existed, that Central Asia cannot be defined. And I quote her in one of my texts saying that at least we all agree on the fact that we don't know anything about the borders of Central Asia, and yet we keep referring to the phrase Central Asia, which officially means at least 3 different things. There is the local 5-country definition, which ironically enough comes from Mackinder, a British geographer. There is the 6 or 7 or 8 country definition, which I tend to press on my colleagues in Central Asia, which they disagree with, including Afghanistan and Iran and part of West Asia. And there is the UNESCO definition or the UN definition of Mongolia, which extends more or less all the way from Iran and beyond to the west and to Mongolia. And there is a last definition, which is a geomorphological definition of the tectonic plate on which the Central Asia rests. And there is a tectonic plate which brings together all those countries I've mentioned and beyond. So if we don't, let me phrase it positively. We should spend some time on thinking about what Central Asia is as a process, I said yesterday, as a dynamic, I said today, of re-emergence, reappearance, reconstruction, reinvention, which I hope you will accept as being a far broader approach than just diplomatic terms of formalism. Could I have some water? Is it possible to have a little? Sorry.
Warm,
Cold. Oh, warm is better, actually. Yes.
warm. I have.
Yes.
I've brought for you, and I need to ask you. It's too warm. Careful.
Thank you very much.
I think I'll have to make some.
I'm not used to this treatment of having colleagues take care of me, but it's very pleasant, and I'm really sincerely grateful to all of you. You're welcome. The next paragraph is called 30 Years of Reinvention as something different from going to the past. Reinvention is not going to the past, although there is a relation or there is a way in which the past should be mobilized and remembered or taken into account, but it is not going back. It is reinventing for the present and for the future, often referred to the future as the extended present, according to the Vienna Sociological School. The real future is, of course, one in which, in the long term, we're all dead, according to Keynes. But the present and extended present is what I have in mind. So we've been going through 30 years or more of reinvention of Asia, the new Asia, Central Asia. And from the informal discussions yesterday, I'm becoming aware that you are, some of you anyway, perhaps thinking that I put together parts of Asia which are different in their evolution, and certainly that I seem to be saying Asia, properly speaking, the whole of Asia, when I have in mind Central Asia, and making South Asia part of Central Asia, perhaps excessively, but we have days to discuss this. So in the case of Central Asia at large, we ought to spend a little time on the terms nations and states, what to do with those two concepts, and what to do with their mix in the expression nation-state, which is the one that you are familiar with and which is the one that we use in Europe, nation-state. But I think in the case of Central Asia, it should be called state-nation, and reflecting upon which came first. I think differently from Europe, in Central Asia, nations have existed before the states, or before the modern states anyway. Central Asian nations are defined, or should be defined, as clans or clanic nations, most of them nomadic clanic nations, which is a characteristic which is relevant here. The only non-nomadic nation in that sense is Tajiks or Tajikistan, of course, as you know, of a Persian origin. And the sedentary characterization of Tajikistan is one different from the other four countries and nations of Central Asia. Incidentally, the history of the state and of the nation in Turkey is one of the sedentarization of a nomadic culture, having become sedentary over time, not so long ago, and today definitely characterizing Turkey differently from the rest of the nations in Central Asia. So when we come to the concept of Turkic nations, and there is now today an organization of Turkic nations, or Turkish-speaking nations, which the name has changed, we are looking at a modern geopolitical concept which is interesting and which I think is homogeneous or coherent, even though the situations of nomadic clans today has changed. What does it all mean that nomadic nations have existed before the states? It means that the cohesion or the structuring of those nations has existed before the modern state, can exist independently of the modern state, and has indeed survived through static upheavals. They have survived through the invention of pre-Soviet colonized situations, and they have survived through 70 years, for some of them, of a federal Soviet system. And this is why they have reinvented themselves so quickly and so in such a stable manner after 1991. And on top of being nations that have pre-existed the state and reinvented after the state was given independence, they are also, interestingly enough, very multinational societies, And to be multinational is a concept with which you are very familiar, but the Westerners are not. And so when we have to deal with multinationality in the West, often we don't understand what it means. The difference between nationality and citizenship, for example, is one with which you are familiar, which is hardly understood in the West. So when you interact with my colleagues, be aware of that. In fact, in French, we use the word nationality exactly in the sense of citizenship, not in the sense of nationality as they use it in Kazakhstan and other countries. So we have countries which found themselves in 1991 with 120 plus nationalities, with a total population of 4, 5 to 6, maximum 15 or 28 million people, which is a lot of divisions. And those divisions in other contexts could have led to almost immediate inter-community, sometimes wrongly called inter-ethnic clashes, and they did not. There were, of course, illustrations of social tensions, which are often presented as inter-ethnic, and which, to me, are definitely more properly economic tensions between poor classes or poor groups in the nation and more wealthy and more prosperous ones. We can discuss, we don't have time, the events of 2005 in Uzbekistan and 2010 in Kyrgyzstan and others. But my main point here in the first point of paragraph 2 is to suggest that to understand how and why state construction took place fairly quickly, efficiently, and in a stable manner in 1991 plus is the fact that there is a huge degree of pre-existing structuring social, historical, and cultural elements which made the stability possible. And again, as I said yesterday, on paper, in 1991 or in 1992, there were more reasons to believe that instability would ensue post-Soviet dynamics than reasons to believe that stability would ensue post-Soviet dynamics, and yet stability took over. This happened, my second point in paragraph 2 now, despite the fact that Central Asia is a region where 3 different conceptions of a border overlap. Which 3 conceptions, and you might disagree with me and we can have discussions after the tea break, the so-called Western or European or Russian conception, the Chinese one, and the nomadic conception of a border. From what I call here in this region the Russian conception, which is definitely the same as the European or Western conception of a border as a separating line. It is a line, artificial line, on paper, on the map sometimes, which divides immediately within centimeters 2 totally different sovereign entities. So borders are separating lines. They are lines of absolute separation in the sense that sovereignty is absolute, and there is no other way to deal with that line as to respect it and to consider that crossing it wrongly is an aggression, or to agree by treaty and by international law invented in the 17th century that states can agree together to move the border or change it or share it. But it is a line. It is a line over which crossing is impossible or difficult or strictly monitored, and of course leads to other aggressions and pushing back by one at the expense of the other, or a line which is closed, preventing any forms of exchanges, as I mentioned yesterday, was the case of the Soviet-Chinese border for so many years. The next conception is that of the Chinese political philosophy and diplomatic philosophy of a buffer zone. The border is not a line, it is a zone, it is a buffer zone. Which is large in size and which is conceived of as separating civilization as defined as Chinese or as the all under the same sky and sort of the heart or the core or the yoke of the nation, and the barbarians situated beyond the zone and beyond the confines, and that zone is so to speak, managed in the sense that it is not developed, it is not equipped with the production of resources and foods, and so if the barbarian should attempt to invade and aggress the civilized part of the nation, the barbarian should have to cross this derelict sort of zone and exhaust himself, especially if he crosses it on foot or on horses, and so the idea is that the aggressor would reach the central civilized nation already in a lessened or weakened or exhausted state. And the third conception is that of the nomadic culture, where a border is not a line nor a zone, but a grazing land, fluctuating with seasons and fluctuating with droughts and floods and livestock demography. And the border is not a problem so long as there is enough food or grass for the cattle or for the stock, and the border becomes a disputed grazing land when droughts or excessive numbers of animals are reached. And those three conceptions meet in Central Asia. And they have met in Central Asia for centuries because they have been nomadic nations for centuries. They have been the subject of Russian colonial and then imperial and then Soviet pushing back of the borders, notably of China, into China. And they're also, it is a zone where the confine of the Chinese definition of a border has applied for long. Xinjiang means, as you know, the new border, and so on. And so it is remarkable that within a few months or within a few years, all those three conceptions led to an agreement to sit down around the table and table the border issues and negotiate borders and settle the border issues almost entirely within 1996 and then more formally 96 to 2001. It is something that took place in a few years when it took Europeans the better part of 300 years to reach a very imperfect agreement on the borders. And the Europeans only had one solution to a possible re-emergence of border issues, which is this supra-sovereign, forceful legal obligation to agree, and the invention of a legal monster, which I called yesterday supra-sovereignty, which I would call today the establishment of a court of justice capable of condemning states for non-respect of supra-sovereign rules. This is a very interesting European evolution. Coming to the end of paragraph 2, those situations I have referred to until now does not mean that the territory or the territories are fully stabilized. The territories of Central Asia and territories of post-war situations are not automatically, de facto, overnight stabilized. They are not stabilized in the sense that there are still some border issues. But there are very few remaining classic border issues to do with disputed square kilometers. There are issues, as you know, bringing together China and Kyrgyzstan. There are issues between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, but border agreements reached in the 1990s is the phrase that the border agreement is fixed by the state structure and not the political governmental structure, which means, in essence, in between the lines, that even if the governments change, even if the regimes change, they cannot change the agreement on the border. For example, in our constitution in France, we have a provision, 89, that says that the republican form of the state cannot be altered, which means in our terminology we cannot go back to monarchy. But so similarly, there is no way in which legally an agreement can be changed, the border agreement can be changed, especially between China and Kyrgyzstan, even if the new government coming into power wishes to go back on the border agreement. So it's a very fixed form of agreement. But non-classic border issues have not only remained, but have in fact emerged from the situation of independence. Notably the cross-border water issues, which are prominent ones in Central Asia. They have emerged because of independence. They have emerged because before independence, the Soviet system, centralized in Moscow, was managing the cross-border water issues, attributing certain rights, so to speak, and monitoring the sharing of water resources. Certainly overnight, those new republics found themselves having to manage by themselves their water resources and decide what to do with cross-border issues of the fact that is coming from geography, that the rivers cross the borders. So certainly the tensions emerge between states or nations or countries situated upstream, notably Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, and countries located downstream, specifically Uzbekistan and further on Turkmenistan, as having very different needs. The upstream country need to stock up water in the summer and release it in the winter for hydroelectric production. And the downstream countries need water in the summer for irrigation and are flooded when the water is released in the winter. And those conflicts are extremely high, and in fact they are the characteristic of the possible destabilization of the region. And this has brought situations of extreme tension, with one illustration only, when the Kyrgyz government suggested that they would react to any military form of imposition of water management on the part of Uzbekistan. Now, to suggest that there would be a military response is not a very friendly or neighborhoodly friendly phrase to use. Things have improved over the past 10 years, definitely, but there hasn't come about yet a situation where there would be the creation of a Central Asian Water Management Organization, which to me would be the equivalent for Central Asia of the European Coal and Steel Community of 1951. What the Europeans did was to decide, certainly overnight, to put together the two resources of war, steel and coal being the symbols of war for steel, to build cannons, and coal for energy and industry. So bringing together the resources of war and the resources of industry, of course, ensured that the Europeans at least tried to share the key resources which for hundreds of years had seen them oppose each other and fight each other. The equivalent for Central Asia would be the water management, and I'm sure this would apply also to large parts of Asia, notably because most streams of Asia originate in Tibet, and they flow into India, and they flow into Bangladesh, and they flow into Kazakhstan, and beyond Kazakhstan into Russia. So water management might be a conducive way to actually inventing or creating the nation. I stop here because I'm too long, of course, and paragraph 3 is a continuation of what I've been saying to you, but slightly more systematic. The philosophy of paragraph 3 is to make clear, which I'm sure is more clear to you than to my students in the West, that when we say Central Asia, we might tend to suggest that we are referring to a homogeneous, even modernly, to a homogeneous space, and even to a monolith. And I'm surprised, not here, not in this part of the world, but in other parts of the world, that people are content, or people contend with the idea that when we say Central Asia, we know what we mean. And we mean something which is just a space that can be taken as one, almost as one actor. Which even if there was something called the Central Asian Union, could not be the case. So taking countries one after the other, trying to be quick over it, I just need to underline how different all those countries are, or could be going beyond the number of 5 countries. Mongolia first, I've mentioned before, has very cleverly invented the concept of a third neighbor. And what is the concept basics? Why is it a clever concept? Because it doesn't mean that there is a resistance or negation or opposition to the 2 main neighbors, China and Russia, but there is a third neighbor, which is an opening and a new dimension, a sort of new breathing space, but not defined. The third neighbor is not a country. It is basically, if you read between the lines, the rest of the world. Even if de facto the third neighbor is East Asia, the prosperous South Korea and Japan. If the third neighbor is Southeast Asia, South Asia, and West Asia, and further on, Europe, and the so-called West. And this concept was adopted very early on, in 1993 unless I'm mistaken, and has ever since been kept as the driving force behind Mongolia's diplomacy. So much so that in 2004, when Mongolia was the first observer state to the SCO, colleagues, I was in Ulaanbaatar at the time, colleagues were sort of worried that accepting associate status would jeopardize the third neighbor policy. And so my response to them was it was always better to be in a process than out of a process. That's my topic for the next chapter. And so to be an observer and not a member was the answer to their situation. In French we say betrayed by the technique. A second country is Turkmenistan, which followed a course of its own, which is the course of isolation, or in the technical vocabulary of the country, a perpetual neutrality. Certainly between 1991 and 2006, this changed slightly after the change of president in December 2006, and Turkmenistan did not open up, but modified its essential policy, which is the policy of energy exports, and gradually opening up energy exports or energy exchanges with Iran, and not only purely with Russia. But still today, Turkmenistan is pursuing an isolation mode of existence, with a specific status in the SCO, that of invited guests, the only country guest. I will come back to that. And Turkmenistan as a symbolic dimension, requiring visas for visitors from the other Central Asian countries, whereas those countries among themselves have visa-free regimes, and many of them have visa-free regimes with for visitors coming from out of the region. Third is Uzbekistan, which has had a very interesting alternating attitude to its foreign policy, having a foreign policy between independence and 2005, which was one of caution or slight distance vis-à-vis Russia and proximity with the West, reversing that foreign policy after 2005, and reversing it again after 2012. 2005 is the Andijan incidents, as you know. 2012 is when Uzbekistan opposed the Russian suggestion to alter the treaty of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, making the decision-making mode going from unanimity to majority. So Uzbekistan clearly has had a more fluctuating foreign policy than any other countries that we are looking at. Kyrgyzstan next is a country where political alternation has taken place. Electoral dynamics have brought into power the opposition on several occasions. The president has changed a number of times, 5 times if I'm not mistaken, which is a highest rate of turnover of political parties alternation in the region. Tajikistan has had a very different dynamic, engaged between 1992 and 1997 in the civil war, or a so-called civil war, which is in fact a war between the majority and the opposition, which led to an agreement by which in 1997 a certain number of seats in parliament were secured for the opposition, and a sort of coexistence, a constitutional coexistence has come about, with the other situation where the leader of the country is a long one, whose leadership has extended ever since independence, and also a specific geopolitical location of Tajikistan, which has meant that the country has been an outpost of Russian and then Soviet presence in the region, and today is logically the object of Chinese investments to make Tajikistan a sort of outpost for the Chinese geopolitical presence. Kazakhstan next has had a very long and stable foreign policy, which has meant not just a partnership with Russia that has continued, but a capacity to build a role, a go-between role, so to speak, between China and Russia, and today playing a key international role by hosting a number of conferences, some of them to do with Afghanistan, and some of them to do with Syria and other tense situations in the world. What is happening? 10 minutes. Oof. Afghanistan, I associate Afghanistan and then Iran and then Turkey to Central Asia. They are, to me, in modern geopolitical terms, Central Asian actors. Afghanistan has had to adapt to, as I say in my note, a situation of instability, artificial foreign stabilization, and today a stabilization which is in the hands of one regime that has come back in power, and with the complex situation of Afghanistan, of having, of course, a domestic evolution which is one in its own right, but having a geopolitical fate of being the crossroad of all possible existing innovations of today, not only, if we take this as the main example, the railway connection, the invention of the territory of Afghanistan as a railway knot or a railway crossroad. I have somewhere a very interesting map which shows Asia with three colors, the three colors corresponding to the train wagon gauge width. There is one zone which is the British norm, and the Russian Soviet norm, and the Chinese one. And so whoever wins over the capacity to connect through Afghanistan, notably northeast railways and east-west railways, will ensure Afghanistan's role as a key strategic role in connectivity. Iran, as I mentioned yesterday, is a country whose territory is, of course, absolutely crucial to linking Central Asia to West Asia, the same as Turkmenistan and Turkey, but which has known a very interesting situation between 1979 and 2005 of isolation, and certainly coming out of isolation due to the membership or the observer status to the SCO, and today representing a key actor for the SCO dynamic. Not only because some years ago the then president, Ahmadinejad, was someone very forceful and, as the phrase goes, saying out aloud a number of things which other SCO members thought out silently, notably a critical stance on the West. But today membership of Iran into the SCO has ensured what I refer to as the concept of Asianization of Iran, meaning that Iran is now totally out of isolation, part of a new construction which is a new Asia, and a definitively important actor of that process. Turkey, I mentioned yesterday, my ninth example is Turkey. Of course, to me, the date of 2012 when Turkey becomes a dialogue partner to the SCO is absolutely crucial, irrespective of domestic evolutions, which I take into account very little in my in my approach. Turkey holds the key, at least one of the keys, to the geopolitical future of the whole continent by deciding or not one day to become a member of the SCO. I mentioned this to you yesterday. Coming to the last paragraph, paragraph 4, called the, there is a mistake on the form. It should be the emerging, not the merging, the emerging new grade game. Is that clear? Yes? The emerging new grade game and the competition in Eurasia, simply suggesting a number of alternative, let's call them alternative, not competing, visions or schemes for Central Asia. There is a scheme called the Greater Central Asia. That's the vision of the USA, I was going to say perhaps of the West, but no, this is clearly a sort of American suggestion to create concepts, the greater Central Asia, the greater Middle East, and other greater approaches to the region, which seem to be giving the impression that they are taking together countries which could, taken together, have a meaning, but which in fact echo the foreign policy priorities of the USA. It is probably easier and simpler from the point of view of the USA to envisage the Middle East as a great entity and allied to the USA, and Central Asia as a one entity and to some extent allied or partner to the USA. That does not correspond to the reality for two reasons. First of all, because foreign policies might disagree with this, but also because in geopolitical terms, the USA is a peripheral actor, not a, it's maritime and peripheral actor, and not a neighbor in that sense. I'm often struck by the fact that in East Asia, the peninsula of Korea is referred to as being Korea and four neighbors: Japan, Russia, China, and the USA. The USA is only a neighbor if we go along Alfred Mahan's theory of the projection of power. If we do, then of course they are projected in the Mediterranean, in the Western Pacific, and so on. The next vision is the SCO Asia. The SCO Asia, which corresponds to the Shanghai dynamic, inclusive of China. China is not only part of the Shanghai dynamic, to some extent the launcher or creator or initiator of the Shanghai dynamic, which I accept as a concept. I'm less at ease with the idea that China de facto dominates the Shanghai dynamic. Maybe the name of the organization is something that has to be explained. If it was called the Astana Cooperation Organization, things might be different, or the New Delhi Cooperation Organization, or the Moscow. So if we call it Shanghai because the headquarters is there, then there is an ambiguity as to the Chinese-ness of the organization. To me, it's less Chinese than Central Asian, than as a potential and lasting dynamic that is reorganizing the whole region. Then we come to the East Eurasian dimension in the form of the Eurasian Economic Community of the 2010s, and then of the 90s and 2010s, and then the Eurasian Economic Union from 2015 and 17. This is the inclusive economic New Asia, exclusive of China, and of course inclusive of Russia, giving, so to speak, Russia the same role as dominant, so to speak, as China would have a dominant role in the SCO. The fact that the Eurasian Economic Community and then to the Union is Russia-inspired, Russia-dominated, matters less to me than the idea that so long as it seems to be inclusive of Russia and exclusive of China, it is imbalanced. This imbalance would not probably change in diplomatic terms. China is not likely to become a member of the Eurasian Economic Union, but the fact that the territory of the Eurasian Economic Union corresponds to the transit territory from China into the west of the continent, incidentally corresponding to the new Silk Roads or new transport corridors scheme, merging in fact the material aspects of the new Silk Roads with the diplomatic aspects of the Eurasian Economic Union, suggests that in fact the Eurasian Economic Union's space is a natural extension of the Chinese export, land export dynamics. Now we come to the role of Pakistan, and I call it the energy facilitator Pakistan. And I need to give you two explanations to that phrasing. First of all, I remember when we produced the first book on the SCO that there were chapters on Pakistan, incidentally written by colleagues from Iran. I couldn't find at the time colleagues from Pakistan. And they kept referring to the concept of playing a role. That the motivation, because we ask authors to answer two questions. What was the country's motivation for joining or wanting to join the SCO? And secondly, what could the SCO bring to the country's foreign policy and to the country's interests? And so the answer was for Pakistan, the capacity to play a role. On the one hand, the the wish and the desire and the ambition of the country, Pakistan, to play a greater role in the region, and at the same time that role being facilitated by the membership of the SCO, which in a more subdued way suggests that the SCO represents for Pakistan something less complete, but still, as for Iran, a capacity to go beyond its own national policy. The second reason is that indeed cartography suggests that Pakistan is the land territory connecting highly consuming energy India and highly producing energy the Kashmir area. And so, as I mentioned yesterday, the territory is in energy geopolitical terms ideal for Pakistan to derive revenue from that role, and so possibly it should. The next is India, which I call in my notes the normalizer, not a very respectful term perhaps, but one that is highly potentially respectful indeed, in the sense that in my approach to the new Asia, India being not only a large market, a large technical advanced country and a large economic actor, but situated outside the original zone of the Shanghai dynamic, which is basically China, Russia, and Central Asia, has a mediator role to play, or has a balancing out role to play, and therefore the triangle analogy I used yesterday, which is Russia, China, and India, is indeed a triangle which could be negatively exclusive of the countries in the center of the triangle, or positively one stabilizing or one monitoring a triangle of not only Central Asia, but other, not lesser states, but other middle powers in the dynamic. So the role of India is so great, not because I'm here in India, but in my academic analysis, that I suggest to call the SCO number 2, starting from 2015-17. To me, 2015 is the key date because that's the decision to apply and the acceptance of the application. 2 years later, for signing the documents is a technicality to me, so I date 2015 the key date, which incidentally is not very far from 2014-13, which is the launch of the new Silk Roads. So to what extent is India's membership, not from the point of view of domestic politics, but from the point of view of international politics, a response to the Silk Roads is an open question. Next, the new periphery. It's time, I know, Professor Kumar, don't tell me, I know it's 10:30. The new periphery is Belarus, Ukraine, Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia, and the Himalayas. All those countries, or many of them, have in the meantime become dialogue partners to the organization. Rightly so, because they are cartographically speaking located in the relevant region. But interestingly so, because they were until then states of which we didn't think as key actors of New Asia, either because they were isolated in the mountains or small in size or taking up in other dynamics. Cambodia, part of the ASEAN, is both, very interestingly enough, unless I'm wrong, the last country to join the ASEAN in 1999, correct me if I'm wrong, and the first country of South Asia to become affiliate to the SCO. Belarus is, of course, an interesting case because it is very much a European state, but very early on hooked up on the Russian dynamic, and very early on becoming a partner to the SCO in 2009, then an observer, and now, since last year, I think 2 years ago, a member. So the Asianization or the SCOization of Belarus is now a done thing. In a region of Europe where, of course, there are a number of uncertain dynamics involving Poland, the Baltic states, and Belarus, and the east of Europe. So that brings me to the end of paragraph 4, which is to go back to the concepts of center and periphery, very classic concepts, very perhaps to you disappointing as being too classic, but I think still interesting. We are indeed, in the short phrase, Professor Kumar, I'm suggesting that there is a new center, which is definitely an extended center, which now extends from east of China to Belarus and to the other affiliates of the SCO. And there are new peripheries. The new peripheries are distant peripheries in Sparkman's vocabulary, the USA or America, or non-continental actors. And the closer peripheries, not amphibious, because what Sparkman says amphibious, he has in mind the Japanese archipelago and the British Isles. But there are peripheries to this new Asia, and the peripheries are shrinking. The peripheries are basically today the European Union to the west, and Japan and the two Koreas to the east. And so we don't have time for guesswork, but we should perhaps keep in mind the meaning for the new Asia of the day when, possibly, Turkey becomes a member of the SCO, Korea, South Korea, or in my wishes, unified Korea becomes a observer or dialogue partner to the SCO, which would be a day, and of course other countries in the formerly called Middle East and the contemporarily called West Asia become affiliates to the SCO. Now, before Professor Kumar takes the floor and says to me that he disagrees, I am definitely strongly suggesting to you that the SCO dynamic is an indispensable key to understand the new Asia. And I give the impression perhaps of being exclusively obsessed with the SCO dynamic, which I'm not. I mentioned yesterday a dozen other organizations that have been created or reactivated in the region. And this is where the discussion can take place. The SCO is neither over-determining the fate of the new Asia, is not over-determining, and similarly, the European Union is not over-determining the fate of Europe. There are a number of other European organizations that make absolute sense. The OSCE, although it goes beyond Europe, the Council of Europe is one, and there are a number of other existing organizations in the new Asia. I'm just suggesting to you that the Shanghai dynamic is one necessary step in our analysis to understand the new Asia. 4 minutes late, I'm sorry. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So friends, we disperse for tea, and once again we reassemble.
Thank you for the clock. Thank you for the clock. My best friend. Oof. Well,
Maybe after that?
So how much time do we have? It's 12 o'clock. When do we finish the session completely?
Yeah.
When do we finish?
So about one.
One.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, but I should be very brief.
More than an hour. Maybe more than an hour.
Yes, but the main.
The discussions also have to be part of it.
Yeah, the discussion should be the major part of this. Yes, right.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's perhaps put on the board this definition from my So since I suggested in the lecture to look at the new Central Asia beyond China, Russia, and India, we could now, as the topic suggests, look at the Eurasianness of Russia, China, India. The Eurasianness of Russia, China, India. We have an expert in the room on the Indian perspective on Eurasianness, but we can mention this and then take questions, if that's okay with you. Yes. So on the screen you have, as a quote, a sort of suggested definition of a region. To be more specific, a definition of what I suggest to call a modern international region. What is a modern international region? This is my immodest claim at my contribution to social sciences. And this definition could be used as an answer to the question, is Central Asia a region? I claim that my definition can be applied to a number of regions or sub-regions in the world. Maybe I'm optimistically wrong, or maybe I'm realistically relevant, I don't know. But this is something that can be kept as food for thought for you in days to come and maybe afterwards. So what do I mean by the Eurasianness of Russia, China, and India? Obviously, I mean the extent to which those three key actors are not just relevant, but willing or actively pursuing the accession to a role to play in the new Eurasia. By which I mean that looking at different parts of the world, Europe, America, Africa, and others, and sub-regions within those subcontinents, we can see usually two dynamics at play at the same time. One dynamic is for any nation, state, or country or government to pursue national interests, and this is a eternal determinant of foreign policy, and at the same time to do so, pursue the national interest through whatever exists as diplomatic fora, in the sense that you can pursue a national interest through isolation, through protectionism, through imperialism, aggressivity, or pursue the national interest in a multilateral way. You can pursue it in a unilateral way, in a peaceful, aggressive way. So whichever way is in history tried by states and nations or kingdoms or leaders, come together today in my understanding of the modern world in the sense that states tend to pursue the national interest through their regional constructions. Of course, they still try to play an active role, globally speaking, on the world stage, so to speak. But my further intuition or my further intuitive analysis is that nations or states or governments which predominantly try to pursue the national interest, nationalistic attitudes are lagging behind the evolution of the rest of the world, which is where states and nations pursue the national interest through regional dynamics or through sub-regional dynamics. And definitely, I suppose I'm suggesting to you, but let me be more clear, that the three countries mentioned in the document, Russia, China, and India, are pursuing their national interests through regional dynamics more and more. This could be disputed, but this is my postulate. Having said that, the conception of what Eurasia is I think, very different. From the point of view of Russia, Eurasia means something specific, and even within being specific, something which has changed. Eurasia never really meant, but to some extent in the past did mean being both both European and Asian, which is part of Russia's geography, history, at least over the past 2 centuries, and so on. But Eurasia has meant in the past, and is meaning to some extent again today, being specific, being different from other sub-regions of Eurasia. Being Eurasian can mean, and does mean, I think, to Russia to some extent, being neither European or Asian predominantly, but being specifically Eurasian, to the extent that being Eurasian is a Russian specificity, that no other state or nation or country or entity can claim to be Eurasian in that sense. Of course, we can discuss this, and I'm sure we will discuss this. The anecdote that I should quote now is my first encounter with students in Almaty, Kazakhstan, and when I put to them the question, which I put to all students usually, what is your identity? And they answered with one voice, almost, we are Europeans. We, students in Almaty, Kazakhstanese, not all Kazakhs, but Kazakhstanese, felt to be European. So I looked at the map and I compared the distance between Almaty and China and Almaty and Europe. And the difference is very great. And so I'm not quite sure what they meant at the time. I have my intuitive understanding of their statement, but I prefer to keep my intuitions to the private discussions here. Now, what does Eurasia means for China? Obviously something new. China cannot realistically suggest to be part of Eurasia going back in history. In history, China is definitely Asian, East Asian, a civilization of its own, with not so much interactions with other parts of the continent until recently. Now, what does recently mean? Does recently mean opening up to the international trade in the late 70s and early 80s? Perhaps not so much, because the opening of China at that time was an opening to international trade, international maritimity. I think Eurasia for China means something that begins in the late 90s as an aftermath of the so-called Asian economic crisis. I can go back to that in the question time if you wish. But definitely through the more recent multilateral constructions, notably the Shanghai Dynamic and the New Silk Roads and other transport corridors. China is Eurasian in a much less conceptual or theoretical way as Russia, or idealistic, or ideal, if the word exists in English, IDAL way. China is Eurasian in a more pragmatic sense. China is pragmatic in the sense that land exports from China reaching Europe have to go through Eurasia. They have to go through, in fact, many Kazakhstan and Russia, and not exclusively through Russia for reasons to do with geomorphology. So China's, I think, approach to Eurasianness would be a pragmatic, commercial, logistical, realist one, and not one based on ideas or visions of self. I'm trying not to use the word ideological, although the word ideological is not rude. It's something to do with the way in which ideas lead the world, and that's idealism in philosophy, so it's not a rude word, but it has become a connoted word, because ideological is supposed to be negatively, which is something to do with ideas. It's a semantic root anyway. Now for India, of course, I am not going to venture to answer the question myself before you. What is Eurasianness in terms of India? But I think in geopolitical terms, it can mean possibly the attempt to India's geomorphology and geography makes it beyond a subcontinent, a maritime actor in many, many ways. But to turn it into a continental actor, I think, is what is meant by the term Eurasia. I hope that Professor Upadhyay will join the conversation in the coming minutes. Whatever the term actually means, what is interesting, I think, is that the question as to whether a nation is more continental or maritime, more Eurasian or South Asian or East Asian, means that there is an ongoing process of redefinition, or redefining, or reestablishment of priorities. The idea that came out of our conference 3 months ago here in this university was that in terms of connectivity diplomacy, India is joining the continental dimension by export routes that link India and Iran, and then from Iran rejoining a network of transport corridors that go from Central Asia to the Middle East and to Europe. which in strict cartographic terms means a detour, instead of going by sea from India to the Gulf or the Red Sea and the Mediterranean, going through Iran, which causes a number of logistical difficulties in reconnecting railways and roads and so on from the Indian coasts to the northern territories, or all the way to Russia, or all the way to Europe, but which definitely means that there is a rethinking or redefining of the way in which India can connect to transport corridors on the continent. But this is true also of the innovations connecting Central Asia to the west of the continent, which is also a new direction by which Central Asia is inventing a capacity to go beyond itself. I'll stop here because otherwise I'll take too much time. But the question of the Eurasianness of the three countries mentioned is in fact the same question as to the regionness of the three states. How those countries consider themselves as playing a role beyond themselves. That's my expression. Beyond how they can pursue their national interests through multilateral and regional dynamics. I'll stop here, if that's okay with you.
So no questions?
No questions, yes.
Please. Floor is open for questions.
कल के क्वेश्चंस जो बाकी हैं पूछ लो
कल के आज के और भी कोई ठीक है? Please. वो कुछ खड़े होकर Three questions at a time.
इनको फिर वहाँ जाना
वो आके आके पूछ सकते हैं आपका कौन माइक लगा No questions. No questions. Looks like no questions. So maybe we could continue. Say something controversial and automatically a lot of questions will come.
Nothing controversial. Yes, we have one question there. Yes.
Very good. Good afternoon, sir. I think a very impressive lecture. I think it was very articulate and good references as well. My question is directly, I think that will be very short. I just want to, like you have mentioned in your lecture, that it is how we perceive a region, right? How nations perceive a region when we are talking about the new Asia. My question is it also that how a nation perceives itself? So is that also one of the interpretations when we are redefining new Asia? So in terms of, like, for example, like how China is, I would say, people often say that China is consumed by the Middle Kingdom syndrome. So is that also redefining Asia and new Asia in your?
So I think there are three questions in your question. How a nation perceives itself, how a nation perceives itself in a region, and how a region perceives itself. Let me evacuate, so to speak, one aspect, which is the fact that if by nation we mean the public opinion or the popular perception of the region, that usually lags behind the evolution. It takes a long time for nationals or citizens of a country to feel part of a new region. The European identity of French, for example, is still not quite certain, and so on and so forth. How a nation perceives a region is one of your questions, and that, to me, is something that takes place in the minds of leaders and decision makers and governments. And I repeat myself, with the new awareness that the national interest is better pursued in a multilateral way, and more specifically in a multilateral way with neighbors. In fact, one of my definitions of region building is the moment when neighbors become partners. And the three key words that we can play with is partners, neighbors, and allies. Neighbors are neighbors by geography, but their geography in history usually has meant that they were aggressors or enemies or at war in many, many ways. So neighbors is not the good news until neighbors understand that they should, at least in the European sense, stop to try to become allies and establish alliances which are short-lived and become partners. The difference between allies and partners is that allies are often allied on a very narrow objective, especially a defensive objective to fight off a risk of invasion. And once the risk is gone, the alliance is also gone. Partners are partners in an open-ended manner, open-ended in time, open-ended in numbers, and open-ended in in the sectors of cooperation. So we can go back to the link between region building and the open-ended characteristic of regions. I'd be happy to go back to that dimension because that would make me very talkative. The next question in your question is to what extent a region perceives itself as a region. Which is the same question as the identity of a region, or the interest of a region, or the capacity of a region, defined as neighbors becoming partners, to pursue a common goal. So to what extent are countries of the new Central Asia partners? And the answer is not fully yet, and with a time gap in between the early 90s and the late 2010s. I can come back to that. To what extent are countries of the new Asia, which is perhaps too wide a term, partners of a new region? The technical answer is they are not. There is no overarching organization for the whole region, except for the Shanghai Cooperation again. But they are becoming, I think, more and more aware that they cannot pursue the national interest by themselves and that as a regional sub-region, they make sense. So what is referred to as a common phrase as the Shanghai spirit, for example, means on the one hand very, very little. What is the Shanghai spirit? Is it a clear, coherent set of values shared over the long term to come among member states, to some extent, of course, but not fully yet. But to what extent does the Shanghai spirit mean nothing? It means something in the sense that there is now of course, it's a phrase that can be used to suggest that disagreements or differences or diverging interests should be overcome. And interestingly enough, the phrase Shanghai spirit has been also used in the expression the Samarkand spirit. And the Samarkand spirit echoes the fact that the Central Asian nations, the 5 of them, are ambitioning to build something which is at present called the Central Asian Forum, which could, I said yesterday, one day become the Central Asian Union, attempted in the early 90s and failed at the time, but which would be the constitution of the missing sub-regional link to the regional construction of the new Asia. So my conclusion to your question, in a simpler way, if I may, is to say that although we don't really know what to call the common identity of a new region, we know that the need for an identity is great if the region is to be accepted among leaders and among the populations. If you go back to the history of Europe, the history of ASEAN, or the history of any sub-regional construction within Mercosur or the Community of West African States, and there is a moment always when someone suggests that there is a common identity that exists. I'm not quite sure what this common identity is within the SCO. I don't know which words to use, but it is there. It is sometimes called the Shanghai spirit, sometimes called the culture of consensus, because consensus is the official decision-making mode within the SCO. So that's my long answer to your question. But then my question to you as a person or to you as an audience would be, what is your view as to the acceptance or identity of a region in your case? What would you answer if I ask you to define the identity of South Asia? Is it something totally abstract, something non-existent, something attempted but failed within the SAARC association? What is the perception of India and Indians as to membership of SCO? I'm told that it doesn't amount to very much yet, but it will at some point. Is it an artificial concept, or is it a strategic coin phrase that governments can use to actually invent a common identity, which is the case of the new Central Asia? The SCO, interestingly enough, has produced early on, much earlier in its construction than the European Union has, or the European communities, a SCO university and an SCO cultural day, which takes place usually the day before the SCO summit, and some corresponding creation of a student mobility within the SCO. That's the SCO University. And in many ways in Europe, when we found out that we were lagging behind the invention of a European common identity, we created the Erasmus student mobility scheme in order to create commonality among students, which then become adults and which then become decision makers. So it's all a very stimulating area to reflect upon the creation of a common identity, and at the same time a very frustrating area, because we would like to be able to answer the question and we can't. Having said that, if you go back in history, there was, I think, for every nation and country, a moment when we invented a national identity. The word French or France, in what it means, was clarified maybe 300 years ago, not much longer. Technically, it was clarified before, because there was something called the French Kingdom from the 11th and 16th centuries in particular. But the French identity as national identity, something was clarified later on. And today, the French identity is in large part republican, whereas it was for a long time monarchical. What is the German identity, Italian identity? Something very new. The Indian identity, that's for you to tell me. But these questions have come about for every nation in history at some point, more recently for Central Asia, but they had to invent an identity. They called it, for Kazakhstan, for example, Kazakhstani identity, based on the concept of being a republic and being secular. These are all almost synonyms. But this went to the point of suggesting to rename the country. Not Kazakhstan, meaning the land of the Kazakhs, but Kazakh Ilye, which means the nation of the Kazakhs. And the same Ilye is present as a Turkic word in Mongol Ilye, which is Mongolia. What does the name change actually produce as a result? I'm not quite sure. But it shows the fact that with the change of diplomacy, the change of with independence and the rethinking of what a country nation is, sometimes the identity question takes the form of a change of the name of the country. Turkey has become Turkey at the same time. It's the same root. Ilye in Turkic languages means, and Mongolian is a Turkic or Uralo-Altaic language, closed in etymology to Turkic languages too. Thank you for your question.
Sir, you mentioned about the nation state in your lecture. So I would like to ask that what do you mean by nation state in Central Asian context, like not nation state as such? So is it in line with the concept put forward by Yuan Lins, Alfred and Yogendra Yadav in Indian context, where they talk about the lecture of building nation and building democracy? So I would like to know views about Central Asian.
Yes, states and nations, I think, are enough food for thought. Democracy is not a debate. We can open it, but if we do, I will disappoint you with my definition of democracy. states, nations, the issue is which came first. My contention, which may be wrong, is that in the case of European construction, the nations came first, and then the modern states came second. By the modern states, we mean parliamentary monarchy or republics, or the evolution over the past 200 years, more or less. Although, of course, in the case of Britain, the revolution and parliamentary monarchy was invented earlier on. But we have a moment in the 19th century, from the 19th century, to simplify things, where the modern state was invented. And therefore, whatever the word nation-state means, our situation in Europe is one where nations were invented before the states. And the states means something quite modern, quite institutional, to do with constitutional dynamics and so on. For Central Asia, I would argue that the states were constructed before the nations. If we redefine a state as being a sort of centralized, authoritative political structure, which was then, of course, a pre-modern state, the Khanat, or the invention of a centralized, effective political structure, which is, I don't know how you would translate Khanat in English, but probably something to do with...
Annex.
Sorry, the English word is Khanate, I'm sorry. But how would you translate Khanate in English? Difficult, because it's a specific term, but it means the capacity of an accepted, legitimate, of course, authoritarian, authoritative, equipped with a monopoly of authority, to hint to Max Weber's approach to the state as having the monopoly of legitimate violence. That has pre-existed, and there was a few years ago, interesting debate between the Russian leader and the Kazakh leader, Nazarbayev, as to which pre-existed, the Russian state or the Kazakhstani state. And they had a fierce disagreement, where one suggested that the state in Kazakhstan was a very recent invention, meaning post-independence. And the other argued that the Kazakh state dates back to the 15th century at least, as a unified, centralized political system able to do what a state does, that is to stabilize, organize, manage, rule over the nation. Now, when I say the state pre-existed the nation, I'm fully aware that if colleagues from that area were in the room today, they would disagree. What I do mean is that the national, multinational characteristic of those countries is the product of the 20th century. And the fact that all those countries in Central Asia are multinational, having, I repeat, over 100 different nationalities, which is a huge amount, at least for such a small population in some of them, is the result of the displacement of populations in the 20th century. Displacements of the populations within the USSR as part of a policy or as part of a realist policy. I have in mind in particular the displacement of, is that what it's in English, displacement? Is that okay? Do you understand what I mean? Yes? Displacements of East Asians into Central Asia following the Japanese expansion into the continent, where Japanese and Koreans, North Koreans, at the time the Koreans living in Manchuria were displaced into Kazakhstan in vast numbers. The fact that also a huge number of war prisoners were moved from the European Second World War theater into Kazakhstan, war prisoners from Germany in particular, but also a number of... and so when you look at the composition of the population of Kazakhstan today, you find not equal numbers, but significant numbers of what is referred to, a term I don't like very much, ethnic Germans or ethnic Poles or ethnic Greeks or ethnic Turks and so the rest of it. And so that multinational characteristic of the nation is something that I would suggest goes back to the 20th century. Not exclusively. So to suggest that the state pre-existed the nation, I think, is a phrase that can make sense for that region. Which means, I think, as a conclusion, that any destabilization of the state is something more traveling in Central Asia than it could be in Europe. France in particular has gone through a number of very different regimes, some of them stable, some of them unstable, not affecting the nation in that sense. So to phrase it positively, I think it is more difficult, more complex to manage a multinational society such as the ones in Central Asia. So when we come to, if I understood your question correctly, can you repeat your question now? Because then I need to conclude, to go back to your question.
So I was just asking that, like, how do you define state mission in circulation context, which you answered already. So I was just asking, does it have some similarity with Indian context, like, which is the dual act of building democracy and building nations? So, like, is there any element of democracy building in this? Like, I don't see that, of course.
Okay. Well, I said we'll keep the debate on democracy for some other occasion because it's either too complex or it's often approached in a way which I find reductive. For India, I don't know. It's for you to tell me. What does the expression Indian nation mean? How you would characterize it? Is there such a thing, a clearly defined thing as an Indian identity? I don't know. As a non-Indian, I would say that the identity is a federal, continental, and transformative from a South Asian subcontinent to a pan-regional actor. I'll stop here. Yes.
So, in the last class, you talked about the construction of New Asia, where you were saying that we should not mistake to compare cooperation with integration. So, sir, I want to ask you, how do you see this from a Central Asian perspective? Like, how the Central Asian countries will see this perspective that Asia cannot be integrated the way it was done in Europe?
Thank you very much. So first of all, following from tea break discussions, I should replace the expression "the new Asia" with the expression "the new Central Asia." Why did I use the expression "the new Asia"? Because in my mind, the whole of the continent, the whole of Asia is evolving. But I'm fully aware that in some ways, which I'm told is acceptable to you, I should suggest that this new Central Asia is the core of my approach, and that the rest of Asia is the periphery to the new Central Asia. If the word periphery is understood as being a very respectful and constructive term, and not as a derogatory term, of course, being peripheral as opposed to being central can be ambiguous. The use of the two concepts, integration and cooperation, I stick to very much as one intuition that has led me over the past years, and this intuition has become a very something of which I'm very aware now, helping out comparisons. If we compare regions in the world, we should compare their capacity to innovate from the past. And so region building means a capacity to innovate from the past. In the case of Europe, to innovate from our past has necessarily meant to invent integration as a supra-sovereign, forceful process. Why? Because before we attempted that in the 1950s, we were totally unable to stabilize ourselves, to refrain from fighting each other, and to respect our own inventions of national sovereignties. There is an interesting book by a French geographer called Fouché, who analyzed the issue of border conflicts in Europe over the time period from the mid 18th century to the mid 20th century, 200 years, starting 100 years after the Westphalian Treaty, suggesting that in 100 years, European leaders had had time to get used to the new concepts of sovereignty, territorial sovereignty, and so on. And yet, in those 200 years, mid 18th century to mid 20th century, in his approach, the Europeans fought 160 international wars, with the negotiation of 16 what he calls decisive treaties. Decisive treaties are treaties, peace treaties, which reshuffle borders. Examples of which, of course, is the Vienna Treaty of 1815 and the Versailles treaties of 1919. So, if that's the case, it means that we had no hope for stabilization if we continued with cooperation, alliances that were never stable and which proved totally unstable, except for the exception, perhaps for some time, of the Holy Alliance of 1815. In the case of Asia, my contention is that the capacity to invent, to innovate, is to invent cooperation. That the degree of cooperation reached is a token by which we can compare, if we want to compare, the new Asia with the new Europe. How far has Asia been able to invent cooperation is relevant. How much integration there is in Asia is not relevant, because integration is not the aim, is not the historical fate of the region, and certainly not in the supra-sovereign way. So the capacity to invent cooperation is one characteristic of the SCO, not because the name has the word cooperation in it, but because the reality of the SCO is to invent, at the same time, reinforcement of sovereignties or rediscoveries of sovereignties. And to a large extent, I suppose I could be acceptable to you if I suggested that over the past 30 years, Chinese sovereignty and Russian sovereignty have been reinforced. But at the same time, the newly independent countries, Kazakhstan and the others, have reinvented, reaffirmed, redefended, and reestablished their sovereignties. So that is clearly not nationalistic, but a national sovereign affirmation. At the same time, they have invented advanced forms of cooperation. Now, I would suggest to call it integrative cooperation, but we can take away the word integrative if it's too strong, and suggest that cooperation over border issues, border negotiations, military cooperations, military maneuvers, cross-border investments, the establishment of a common budget for SCO members, the cooperation of national banks, interbanking association, business council within the SCO, all these things are examples and realities of cooperation. Not least the RATS structure, the regional anti-terrorist structure, of which you're aware. Yes? Yes? Based in Tashkent today. Interestingly enough, created in Bishkek and then moved to Tashkent a year later, which is basically a structure where secret services share information. Now, for secret services and states to share information is something quite advanced. We have the equivalent in Europe, which is Interpol and some of the structures. I don't know whether you have a similar secret services cooperation within SARC, but to share secret information is something quite advanced for states, especially for states which have recently only reaffirmed their sovereignty. The RAT is created, unless I'm wrong, in 2002, 2003, which is more or less 10 years after independence, and 1 year after the creation of the SCO itself. That's quite advanced. So cooperation is a reality of the region. It's a definitive form of invention. And so that's my answer to you. But I'd be happy for you to suggest an alternative term. Not integration, no cooperation, not Asianization, to qualify the new Central Asia or the new Asia. Yes, sir.
So I actually want to ask you, am I audible?
Yes, yes.
So how would you respond to the charge by Jeffrey Mankoff in his book Empires of Eurasia that countries like Russia, China, Turkey, and Iran are making this entire Eurasian landmass safe for empires? Especially when I increasingly feel this is a very Western-centric perspective. Also, because you said China's strategy in Central Asia is primarily pragmatic, and even beyond that. free trade and commerce and all of that. And also, if you could just expand a little bit on the Russian specificity in the Eurasian context.
Well, complex question. First of all, authors write books, Bankov and others, which are learned books. Some of them become fashionable, and concepts pick over by the press and become explanatory, mandatory tools. They can always be disputed. There is a French author who wrote a book, I think, entitled something to do with the three new empires, by which he means the renewal of former empires, the Ottoman one, the Persian one, and the newly established capacity of Saudi Arabia to play a role in that part of the world. And I found myself 10 years ago in Rabat in Morocco, where the Moroccans themselves were picking up the idea of the new Neo-Ottoman Empire as a justification for Turkey's contemporary enhanced role in the vast region linking the Middle East to Northern Africa, not Arabic, but Muslim. I don't know if that's relevant. And this was perceived as a fashionable thing to say, but a anachronic position. I think the time of empire building or empire imposition is gone. If we suggest that empire building still exists, it exists in commercial terms, industrial terms, monetary terms, but no longer in vertical, unilateral, or territorial terms. This could be disputed, I'm sure. That was one part of your question, right? So the concept of empire, I think, is outdated, unless we redefine it. But we can always redefine redefinitions and redefine redefinitions of definitions, and there is no end to it. What the concept that I would suggest to use today is the one of centrality and coherence. The word coherence I haven't used yet in this classroom, but it is part of the regional building dynamic. Coherence, I think, is a term that I would suggest to use even as a criterion to regional building, even before the word identity, which we tried to define at the same time. To what extent can a regional project or vision bring coherence to neighbors? That is my view. Your next question is on Russia, and you haven't used the term Eurasianness for Russia in your question, but I think that's what perhaps you have in mind. What is happening and has been happening over the past 20 years, definitely, is a redefinition by Russia of the term Eurasia, giving Russia a specific and specific uniqueness, if you accept the repetition in terms. To the extent to which Russia is unlike, is part of Europe and Asia in terms of geography, but specific in terms of geopolitics or in terms of its role to play. Which you should ask questions themselves what they think about this, but which seems to me an evolution which can make the regionness of Russia more difficult. And I see no incompatibility, as I've suggested to you many, many times, in the simultaneous pursuit of the national interest within a construction with neighbors. I think that's the evolution of the past decades, that a state or national government or country pursues, as it has for almost ever, its national interest, but with the capacity to cooperate and or integrate with neighbors. And so at the same time as you have this attitude of Russia towards being specific, And the ambition to be specific is not just Russian, it concerns other nations in the world. The Japanese have it. They even have a word for it, Nihonjiron, which means the specificity of the Japanese. So that can be is a characteristic of Russia, at the same time as Russia plays a key role in very important multilateral constructions. One of them is the Eurasian Economic Union. The other is the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which are clearly multilateral. And that's where I would stop before I come to the idea that within those multilateral institutions, one country, Russia, plays a dominant role, which is exactly the same term suggested for the USA in NATO. Does the USA play a dominant role in NATO? Yes, in terms of macroeconomic or macro budgetary terms, but NATO doesn't make sense without all its members. Yes?
Good afternoon. I have this question that Peter Hopkins is in this Great Game. He shows that the era of Great Game was much more kind of dominant due to the conflict between the British and the Russian empires and for the domination in the Central Asian region. In your analysis, you portray SEO as a dominant factor, and where geopolitics is the main dominant player. And the new actors that you drawn, you focused. EEAU, SEO, and the other many actors. But do you think that BRICS can be a factor, and if it is or if it is not, why so?
So the SEO and BRICS, is that your question?
Yeah.
Yes.
Can BRICS be a factor in the whole your analysis? Because I think SEO is the dominant thing in your narrative and in your exploration. And the other thing is that the new Great Game that you are exploring is much more portraying geopolitics more into the narrative, but the whole historical and historical analysis somewhat missing. Do you think so?
Much is missing from my explanations, I'm sure. That is the starting point. We are here to fill in my voids. I think your question triggers and I thank you for it, because it triggers a very necessary discussion on the institutional and functional dimensions of Eurasia today. I think definitely with the SEO we have an institutional initiative, institutional reaction, institutional instrument created, brought about, and used to answer the question of what to do with the post-Cold War. And what to do with the post-Cold War is, if possible, stability versus instability. And so the SEO was created as a security organization from the very beginning, focusing on the resistance or fights against the three factors of destabilization: terrorism, separatism, and activism. But very quickly opening up and enlarging to economic programs. The first one was adopted, unless I'm wrong, in 2003. And the next one was adopted in 2015 at the UFA summit for 10 years until this very year. So there is the fact that there is a need for an institutional construction is obvious, because we are dealing with states, with diplomacies, with borders, with public actors, and that's what states do. They manage societies, they manage stability, if they can, and in that case they have. They have avoided the mistakes of instability, as I tried to make clear yesterday. At the same time as we have this institutional construction taking place with the SCO and, I repeat, a dozen other organizations. By the way, yesterday I made a mistake. I called the CICA something wrong. It's the Conference for Interaction and Confidence Building Measures in Asia. The C is confidence building, not cooperation. We have a functional evolution that is taking place, and two essential functional dynamics are taking place. I call them programs to differentiate them from organizations. One is the New Silk Roads, and the other indeed is BRICS. So I would agree with you, sir, and many of you informally in our discussions, that the BRICS is a dynamic which in many ways is a response or a competition or a challenge to the New Silk Roads. In the sense that the New Silk Roads is an initiative by China to functionalize its capacity to initiate, perhaps dominate, I don't know, but to initiate new transport corridors on land and at sea, linking the key actors of international trade, which happen to be the BRICS countries. So the BRICS is a different type of program. I call it a program again. You may dispute the term, but this is the term I use. It's a program. It's a form of functional cooperation that is a response or an alternative or a complement. I'm not saying it's a clashing reality, but it's a complement to the New Silk Road initiatives. That's my short answer to you. My less short answer would be to look into the membership of the SCO and the membership of the BRICS, and to suggest that in both cases, if we reason in terms of affiliates, not full members, but affiliates, I repeat, affiliates to me means the whole category of members, observers, dialogue partners and guests for the SCO, or possibly for the BRICS, the members and the associates, if the status exists. If we take into account the total number of affiliates, it is exponentially growing. The BRICS recently has gone from how many members to how many members? Almost doubling the number?
10 now.
10 from what? From
all over the world.
Yes.
Yeah, 5.
From 5 to 10. So doubling the number, and the SU has gone in very few years from 6, 10, 12, 15 to today 26, which is very rapid. So to think of both the New Silk Roads and the BRICS as a form of competing or complementary or complementing a simultaneous or parallel evolution of the world, I think is a good approach. This is your approach. And to think in terms of how functional cooperation is more concretely relevant than institutional, high political, high diplomatic construction is, I think, a very valid avenue for research. PhDs or master's thesis, I don't know, but yes. The capacity to cooperate without excessively formalize, I think, is a good avenue for reflection.
Okay, so last question. Who wants to enjoy the last question? Please come forward. Yeah, so this is the last one. Yeah.
Good afternoon, sir. So my question to ask you is, in your lecture you were mentioning about reason. About reason.
Reason.
Yeah. Eurasian is about India, Russia, and China.
Space.
Region, yes.
My question to you is that is only institutionalization of the country, as you were mentioning about Belarus joining SCO, is the Asianization of the Belarus. So is only institutionalization of a country makes them as a belonging to that region? In your interpretation is a lacking about historicity and making of the region. And my question is that only one factor that makes a country belonging to that region?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. Can you put on? Oh, I'm sorry for something. I'm very sorry. I need to go against my definition of a region and submit it to you. Your question brings to my mind two things. One thing is that, if I may use a very violent suggestion, that historicity or historical origins or the long-term historical reality, we can put away to some extent. It is relevant to understand things more fundamentally, but it is less relevant to understand contemporary adaptations by states and governments to new realities. In the case of the country you mentioned, Belarus, and in that area comes to me the concept of the necessity to choose. In our region, I don't know about yours, but following the Cold War and following a number of events, countries and nations found themselves having to choose one way, which is West, which is the European construction, or NATO, or both, and the other way, which is East, whether the Russian sphere of influence or the new Asian construction. And so there is, if you go from northern Scandinavia all the way to the Middle East, a sort of arc of countries which had to make a choice. Some of them did make a choice. Some of them haven't yet made a choice. And those which haven't yet made a choice are to some extent unstable or destabilized. Very gross general statement, but let me explain. If you go from north to south, you find countries making a choice very early on, the Baltic states, some of them declaring independence as early as March 1990, which is before the attempted coup in Moscow in August and before the 1991 events, of course, and then as early as possible choosing West in the sense of the EU and NATO. Some of them choosing early on East, which is the case of Belarus. And so on, you could go down to, then you come to the situations of Ukraine and Moldavia and even to some extent Turkey until recently, which have not made the choice very clearly, certainly for Ukraine and Moldavia and other countries. You could suggest that Iran and Turkey have chosen East over West in many, many ways. Iran more than Turkey, but Turkey still to some extent. So not making the choice creates instability because there is a strong pressure of joining what we used to call we used to call alliances, and which I call now regions. So Belarus is in that sense an easy case. It chose East, it chose Russia. It is little known that there is a treaty between Russia and Belarus. I forget the date. We create an economic union which paves the way for possible what is it called? Unification or union state. So there is more than the proximity beyond the etymology of the names of the countries. So it is no surprise that if instability came about in Ukraine, when did it come to Ukraine instability? Exactly the year, from memory, in 2013, when Ukraine was offered the choice of two impossible or incompatible directions: association with the EU or association with the then Eurasian Economic Community. And the schizophrenic offer led to or echoed a difference in opinion between the leadership, president of the country, and the popular opinion and nation of the country, with the ensuing instability, which in geopolitical terms is very simple to understand. Of course, in human terms, it's a tragedy, but still in geopolitical terms, this is what happens. So my answers to you would be the concept of the arc of countries from Scandinavia to the Middle East having to make a choice, because history suggests that a choice has to be made, and some of them making an early choice, some of them making a late choice, some of them not making a choice, some of them having a very difficult time making a choice. So yesterday I quoted from memory my own definition. This is a bit of a narcissistic attitude on my part, I'm very sorry, but to define a region as a modern international region in a way which can be applied to several sub-regions in the world. It is a new awareness that comes in the minds of leaders and governments that they have no choice in terms of history. They have no choice but to invent something new, which is a way to interact, which has not before existed in history, which is to become partners in an open way, leading up to increase in membership, increase in sectors of cooperation, and extended over time, if not irreversible, to some extent irreversible. If you go back to the charter of the SCO, the word is there. I forget exactly what the word is, but there is an expression which means that it's opened up in time. And in fact, in the European case, this was so much implicitly in the minds of the founders of the European communities that the provision for leaving the treaty did not exist. or the provision for expelling a member did not exist until very late, until the 2007, if I'm not wrong, Lisbon Treaty. And so, not at the cost of, not at the expense of sovereignty, but compatible with the re-strengthening of sovereignty, but not in a nationalistic, antagonistic manner, but in a way at the same time which provides the union. The new region provides a framework within which to table, within which to discuss, and within which to address the rivalries. So, however imperfect this definition is, it contains a number of dimensions which I think are at least relevant to understand the new region. Now, if you put in that definition the word Europe, or America, or Africa, or Asia, you might find that it's a costume which is imperfectly cut, but which at the same time contains a number of dimensions which are relevant: historical, diplomatic, political, cultural, and so on. Thank you so much for your questions.
Thank you, Professor Shabal, for this very, very illuminating lecture. We've all learned a lot, and thank you, dear participants, for the very, very interesting questions that you put up and the deliberation.
Thank you.
So we are done for today. We meet again tomorrow. The lecture starts at 10:30 sharp. You all